Thank you. A very vivid illustration of the unspoiled beauty that is Mala Mala in the Sabi Sands Reserve. A very warm welcome to Dan Really Likes Wine, presented by Pick n Pay, and welcome to what is a wonderfully indulgent stretch of South Africa. I've been up for the last few days in this part of the world with Ranger Buck Safaris, Archie Rutherford and his team, and a couple of very special guests, John Smith and his wife Roxy, as well as Janelle de Villiers and his wife Jean-Marie. They're all out with Ranger Buck, Archie and his team, checking out the wildlife that you've just been seeing on camera. I am not. Instead, I'm in a very happy place. I'm sitting in the Buffalo Bar at Mala Mala. To my right, so just over there, is a rather large wine cellar, and from said cellar, I very happily plucked a number of bottles of wine from what is a really nice wine list. It's a comprehensive snapshot of South African style and terroir, and two of the estates who feature prominently on that wine list will be joining me as I size up some wine from the bush and decide what to be having with dinner around the Burma a little later on this evening. So a warm welcome. Thank you for joining us. And a big thank you to both Ranger Buck and to Mala Mala, who sorted us out. A big thank you too to Sabi Earth Lodge, our host for the last couple of days. And I found myself there at Mala Mala. And in fact, as I look out the window, everyone else has gone out on a game drive in search of all this wildlife. About probably 100 yards from me now is a herd of close to a dozen elephant with a couple of young, just going for a late afternoon stroll, the kind of stroll which should really have a glass of Sauvignon Blanc or Chardonnay accompanying it. They might not have them, but I certainly do. And I'm going to be trying both of those in just a moment. And I'm heading down to do different parts of the Cape today. A little later on, I'll be joining a guy called Andrew Gunn, an engineer who decided making wine was a far better way to occupy his time. And he kicked off what has now become the incredibly successful Iona estate and Iona brand. I very much doubt there's anyone in South Africa who hasn't had a glass of Iona Sauvignon Blanc at some point. So Andrew will be joining me just a little later. But we kick off with a trip to Stellenbosch and an estate that I was supposed to visit about a month and a half ago or so. I was hosting the launch of Takara's new range, and unfortunately there was just far too much wine from Stuart. I didn't get the chance to nip next door to Thelema, where I believe there is a fabulous new tasting room. So it's on my agenda of things to do when I'm next down in Stellenbosch, but for now I can visit vicariously and taste the wine in reality, because I've got a couple of bottles with me. But before I do that, Rudy is joining us from Thelema. A very good evening. Welcome to Dan Really Likes Wine, Rudy. Oh, I think we've lost your sound. Ah, there we go. Rudy's sound is back. Good evening, welcome, and love you to have here. Normally, if I'd be speaking to you, Rudy, it would be from my cellar in Johannesburg, and I'd be very envious of you because you sit in a glorious part of the world at Thelema. I'd like to think the tables have turned slightly, and for once, it's a winemaker jealous of where I find myself.
Absolutely. No, we all winemakers. It's always a highlight to be invited to taste up in the bush. So, yeah, you're in a happy spot now.
I am indeed surrounded by the bush. I've got the elephants, as I mentioned, just outside. I've also got some terrific wine. I'm looking forward to tasting it with you. But before we get into the wine, the Thelema story, and there is a bit of a theme to both of our estates today, as well as being part of the Mala Mala wine list. You've also been relatively recent additions to the wine scene, and there's some great stories behind both of the estates we engage with today. Give us a snapshot of the Giles Webb story and a monk called Rabelais who really did not behave like a monk is supposed to.
Yes, no, well, maybe just to touch on the history of Thelema briefly and when it started. Giles Webb and his wife Barbara managed to find this beautiful piece of property on top of the Simmelsberg, the Helsberg de Pass, and with aid from Barbara's father, they purchased this in the mid-80s, and Giles had a bit of a master plan, and over time has created from a piece of land or a property that had absolutely no vineyards to really a kind of a benchmark property with regards to viticulture, the vineyards, and he really put this, I think he put iconic New World quality wines definitely on the map for South Africa. And as I say, the winery was built a few years towards the late 80s. And ever since, we've been renewing vineyards. A lot of our Cabernets are on the second generation plantings. Chardonnay, the same thing. So ongoing kind of development. And here we are, a good 30 years plus later.
And very successfully. So I think most people get the feeling, just because of the success of the brand, that Thelema's been around for hundreds of years. As you say, it's only the late 80s. But I think what accentuates that sense of history is when you look at the wine, you look at the crest, it looks like it's got some substance to it. And then it's also got this name, the Abbey of Thelema, inspiring it. This monk Rabelais, generally I'm not much of a church-going type, but this guy sounds like the kind of monk I could have spent a bit of time with, really.
Yes, the Thelema name obviously is derived or taken from writings from Francois Rabelais, who was a French Middle Ages writer, and there's a story where there was an abbey on the banks of the River Loire, and with the name Thelema, and it was after a battle between two giants. It was given as a gift to a monk, and that the lifestyle and the ethos by which the monk and his kind of congregation lived in this abbey was kind of almost in a way what I think the owners really enjoy in life, and that is the quality and abundance and a very laid back party lifestyle almost within reason, I suppose.
It sounds like an excellent source of inspiration for the range of wine, a wine that I find here on the wine list at Mala Mala. And I'm going to ask you a little about pairing not just the wine with the food, but wine with the bush, which is a lot of fun to do. Let's have a look at that wine first, though. The conversation I've had a couple of times. I've been chatting to Jean-Marie de Villiers, Janelle de Villiers' wife this week. She's very involved in the wine industry in Stellenbosch. And we were tasting some Chardonnay from Stellenbosch a little earlier this week when we were down the road at Sabi Earth, and the Chardonnay story in Stellenbosch is not a new one, certainly, but it does seem to be one really that's got a new lease of life, and people are starting to take a lot more notice of Stellenbosch Chardonnay at the moment.
Yes, that's correct. Chardonnay in the early days wasn't widely available, wasn't really available at all. And it's common knowledge that the industry at one stage, not just Stellenbosch, but Robertson and the greater Breda River Valley, sourced planting material and young vines, which they thought was Chardonnay, and it was widely planted, and it turned out to be something else called Auxerrois. And there was a whole debacle and a lot of politics involved. And then Chardonnay, it's been a cyclic history almost like the fashion industry. the Californians really put Chardonnay and a certain style of Chardonnay on the map. Big, rich, buttery, ripe Chardonnays, and that fell out of favor a good few years ago. And to a degree, the South African wine industry was slightly led down that path. And I think there were a good few offerings where we had ripe, buttery, lots of oak Chardonnays, and fell out of favor. And we're in another phase now where we strive to make Burgundian Chardonnays almost, a lot leaner, not complete malolactics, less butter, leaner wines that last a lot longer and are much better expressions of the area we're from.
There is still that creamy finish that you'd expect from a warmer climate Chardonnay, but the fruit is allowed to express itself so much more. In terms of making this sort of wine, when you take away the dominance that was wood for so long in South African Chardonnay, how much more rewarding is it in the winemaking process to get something that I'd imagine would give you a far more accurate representation of the grapes and the terroir of that particular wine?
Well, it's been as I said, it's been almost a full circle. We now, we source at Thelema itself. We have 3 vineyards, and they 2 of them are planted up along the mountain, the Simonsberg Mountain, which is very old decomposed granite forms, and then an older vineyard down in the flats, which is that orange red Hutton type of soil. And we've ourselves have changed our style of Chardonnay to a degree. We were often at one stage slightly riper. We had a little bit more new wood, and now we're down to making wines that are 13% alcohol, and really everything gets vinified separately and kept separate for as long as possible. And a good example is the 2020 vintage, which we're working with right now. The wines have just come out of barrel and getting ready for bottling, and we've been very selective of what we want there. And our palates have, once we taste blind, we work through maybe 200 barrels of Chardonnay. And predominantly the style we want are those slightly leaner, higher acidity, and judicious use of oak. We're only down to about 25% new French oak nowadays, and that's almost an industry norm. Not many people are going much more than that, let alone the 50% that you used to get. So yeah, it's been an interesting exercise. And we guys have fine-tuned it. We know exactly what yeast we want to use. Picking dates are very important. So it's over time now. It's definitely a lot more sharper exercise and very challenging. We'd like to make world-class Chardonnay. Stellenbosch has climate for that, as does the Elgin area where we have our second property, Sutherland. So ongoing challenge, but a very, very rewarding grape to work with, especially when you get it right.
Let's have a taste of this. I'll ask you to do the same purely as part of the work you have to do, really, not because drinking a large glass of Chardonnay is something you'd necessarily want to do. And just introduce people. It's always very easy to drink it, but to try and convey to people what we're drinking is a slightly more of a challenge. What are you getting out of this? What's your reward from this particular glass?
Well, the vintage you guys have got is a little bit older than what I'm sitting with, at 2017. So you would have kind of developed aromatics, a lot of secondary notes coming through there. Generally, when they start off young, they're quite citrusy, lemon, curd. And then you get a kind of a toastiness that comes through as well. And as it gets older, it becomes quite nutty. And you want a fresh acidity. The worst thing is to have a Chardonnay that's had a bit of oak and it's quite a concentrated wine and it's flat. So to counter that, you need to have fresh acidity. And that's the secret of the longevity of Chardonnays, having good chemistry, good low pH, and a decent acidity. But I would think the 14 is, I think it said the 14, that should be really rich and quite special now. As I said, the 17 right now, still years to go, and a lot of legs in it, but both would be extremely rewarding right now.
So it's slightly younger than that. I've got the 14 cab. This is actually the 16 Chardonnay.
Sorry, okay, one
older, but I think heading in the direction you suggest. In terms of pairing, it's always very easy when you go with a Chardonnay. Well, I might have it with some crayfish or another piece of seafood, or possibly something that's got a little bit of spice in it. I'm going to go slightly different. I'm going to pair this with 2 things. One of them will be a roaring fire around a Burma, because I think that's going to be terrific. And I think we've got that later on tonight. But the other, when you head out and you have your sunset drinks, as you inevitably do when you're out on safari, out come those little metal bowls. And in them there is inevitably biltong, and in particular droivos. And I think droivos, with that bit of fat that it always has and that little bit of spice, usually a hint of coriander, that with a glass of Chardonnay as the sun sets down over Mala Mala, makes for a pretty damn good combination.
Spot on there. Yeah, no, I agree with that 100%. And what I've recently had it with is Springbok Carpaccio. There's that that is absolute classic, especially when you've got a nice rich Chardonnay. It really counters that kind of freshness of the Carpaccio. So that's also a very good pairing, I find.
You are a wise and learned man, Rudy. I must spend more time with you. That's an excellent suggestion. I might see if I can find some on the menu this evening. So that is the Chardonnay, and it's another great step forward in the Stellenbosch Chardonnay story. If Chardonnay, though, has its challenge of trying to raise above the ramparts and let people know that it's something you should definitely be trying, then our second wine has no such trouble at all, because our red wine, in particular our Cabernet Sauvignon from Stellenbosch, has a very large flag that waves consistently and proudly indeed. It's in that being said, though, Rudy, when you've got such a great name for a particular wine as a varietal, does that raise the stakes for you, and that every year people are expecting such great things from Stellenbosch Cab?
I think it does in a way. We benchmarked ourselves many years ago on Cabernet and Bordeaux varietals, but Cabernet specifically, and not just Thelema. We the Simonsberg range and Stellenbosch, the greater Stellenbosch is kind of Cabernet Kingdom and Cabernet country. So and to put more focus on it, Giles has twice won the Diners Club Winemaker of the Year award, which is one of the most sought after kind of accolades a winemaker could get, is the Diners Club award, both for Cabernet. So it shows that there's definitely a very good site, this property, for making great Cabernet.
Well, you've got a couple of fans here tuning in from different parts of the world. Skulk Stapelberg, very simply, great wines. And we haven't even mentioned Pinotage. Skulk generally emails us to complain that we don't have enough Pinotage on the show. Skulk, good to see you. And Lisa Harlow, sounds wonderful. My favorite Chardonnay pairing is roast chicken, but liking the sound of your bush pairing, which is one I'll be having a little later on. In terms of Cab, I'm drinking the 14 at the moment. There are lots of interesting discussions to be had around vintages at the moment, and I think the big one is the showy, quite brash, gee, it's good, but it lets you know it, 15, versus the slightly more restrained, taking a bit longer to find its feet, but possibly going to be even better in the long term, 17. I know, chatting to Stuart Buerta next door at Takara, he favors the 15. I go over the road to Mornay at Delegraphe. He reckons 17 is the business. Where do you sit on those two vintages? And then how does a 14, which I'm drinking and which kind of sits in the shadow of those two, feature on your perspective?
Yeah, 14's had the benefit of time now, and at the making of that wine, or that vintage, it was a kind of very cool wet run up to the harvest, and in hindsight, a tricky vintage. And as you said, it's slightly spoken of in the shadows of a 15 and a 17, which were both great vintages. And I kind of like a combination of 15 and 17, to be honest. But the 14, there's absolutely nothing wrong. That's great. It's a great wine. It's a bit of a sleeper. I kind of think it's a bit of a feminine, what they call a feminine vintage, where you have a lot of elegance, soft extraction, but good chemistry. And I think what you're getting right now is, it's rewarding the 6 years of aging now. And it should be a beautiful drink. Actually, I wish I had one of those in front of me now.
Well, I can tell you that for a warm afternoon, and it is particularly warm up here in the Sabi Sands at Mala Mala, this is great. I dropped this in the fridge for literally 10 minutes just to take some of the sting out of the heat, but it has that lightness, it has that elegance to it. It's got that sort of that Syrah nudge of not being big and overwhelming and powerful, which I don't dislike, but I think this is sitting really, really nicely. And if you weren't already envying me for being at Mala Mala, you've got some envying to be doing for drinking your 14, which is delightful.
Yeah, that's a great tip you passed on there. Having slightly chilled, especially in a climate, I mean, up there it can be quite hot and humid, and I think just having it in the fridge for a few minutes or half an hour before you pop it is a great idea. Definitely helps the wine as well.
Yeah, and especially because this has got that slightly lighter character to it, it definitely accentuates that. And I think it's it's a really, really nice cab. Grant Sauls tuning in via YouTube. I'm a big fan of Thelema, Merlot, and Cab. I think there's some Merlot in this cellar as well, plus some of your Mountain Red. So might be a good night of appreciation this evening. Just quickly before we let you head off, Rudy, because I know you've got a CrossFit class to get to in Stellenbosch. The brand, you've got the Thelema brand. You've also got the Sutherland brand. And again, talking to Jean-Marie de Villiers a little earlier, very well versed in her wine and a great palate. She was talking about how of all of your wines, and it's probably your Cab that gets the most attention, for her, it's actually your Sutherland Riesling that is the wine that she particularly likes. Tell us a little bit about that Sutherland label and how it fits into the Thelema picture.
Well, she's got a fantastic palate because it's one of my favorite wines as well. But yes, so Riesling, I mean, you'd know in around the world, even in the old world, Germany, it's a tough sell, and there's a lot of good Riesling, fantastic Riesling in Europe, and it's very sensitive to climate and specific soil types. So one of the oldest vineyards on Thelema in Stellenbosch was actually a Riesling block, and in 2002, we purchased the Southern farm in Elgin, and we planted a block of Riesling there. And it was always a tricky juggle having two Rieslings in your portfolio, and one would cannibalize off the other on sale. So it was quite an interesting little exercise. And last year, we made the decision to pull out the Stellenbosch Riesling and focus solely on the Elgin Riesling, which is a much cooler region, and it's making absolutely brilliant wines. I mean, wines that'll out-age most reds in this country or anywhere else in the world. I mean, they're extremely well-aged wines, and they've got amazing chemistry, so very low pHs, and around the world, it's one of the kind of wines that would age longer than anything else. But it's a great wine, a fantastic food wine as well. I mean, it works incredibly well with spicy foods, and one of the few wines that can deal with spicy food. So, yeah, it's a fantastic drink, actually.
Now, the varietal, there are a few of them, but it's certainly up in the top echelon of varietals that we don't give enough attention to. And once you do discover it, then you do fall in love. A couple of people checking in. Lisa Harlow, again, I've just started drinking my 14 Thelema Cabs. They are exceptional. Well, I can certainly agree with that because mine is disappearing at some speed. And then Helen Nichol, my hard-drinking mother, sitting in Belfast in Northern Ireland, had a Mountain Red last week, and we've got a bottle of Rabelais waiting to cheer up our freezing Irish Christmas. Well, that, Mother Dearest, is a very good call because that Rabelais is a fantastic option. I had some about a month or two ago, and unfortunately my wife discovered it, realized she quite liked it, and drank most of it, which was incredibly disappointing. Last one for you, Rudy. We asked you about pairing the Chardonnay. I gave you some slightly left of center suggestions from my perspective. You backed it up with that great idea for the Carpaccio. The very easy one with a Cabernet Sauvignon is a slab of red meat of one sort or another. Give me something maybe a little more esoteric that you think might work with this 14 Cabernet Sauvignon of yours.
Well, I've been fortunate enough to have it with pork and wild pork. So warthog bush pig. I think it was a warthog that we had, and it was it's got to be prepared quite well, so you'd need to know what you're doing with it. It can be quite dry, but that was a combination that really worked for me. And the other one that would work really well with something like that is the Shiraz. So yeah, that's slightly off center, I think.
I'm not sure if you were suggesting I pair the Shiraz with the pork or pair the Shiraz with the Cabernet Sauvignon, but I quite like the idea of pairing the two red wines together. But I'll definitely bring the warthog in. In fact, I'll see. I'm going to go join the tail end of the game drive once I'm done here, and maybe pick up a stray warthog and bring it home for dinner. Really, thank you. I know I've heard some great things about the new tasting area. I believe it's looking fantastic. It's been a good year and a half since I've been down to Thelema. So I'm looking forward to getting back down and having a look at it. But in the interim, raising a glass to you from up here at Mala Mala. And thank you so much for spending some time with me this evening.
Cheers. Enjoy it.
I certainly will. There we go. Rudy all the way from Thelema, trying both the 2016 Chardonnay, which is aging beautifully, but still has a good few years left in it. And then this wonderfully restrained, understated Cabernet Sauvignon. A lot of Stellenbosch Cabernet Sauvignons, all big chest and shoulders and heart, and shouts a lot, and fantastic for it. But this just a little different. It's a little gentler, a little subtler, and it gives you a beautifully, beautifully restrained feel, and a wine that I really, really enjoy. 6 years old and finding its feet delightfully. So that is wine from the Thelema vineyards in Stellenbosch. However, there is a link to our next estate, because Thelema does have a secondary property up in Elgin, and I don't think it is too far from Iona, which is where we head to now. And another wonderful, wonderful wine story. Andrew Gunn is the man who decided that engineering was far too boring and making wine was far more exciting, or at least that was the idea. And after trekking around and dragging estate agents up and down the Western Cape, finally found the place that he now calls home. Andrew, a very good evening. Welcome to Dan Really Likes Wine.
Hi, Dan. Good to see you. Yeah, it's quite interesting listening to Rudy. Karen, why don't you just close this blind? I'm just getting the light off the back of my head. It's shining on the back of my head. But anyway, Dan, yeah, it's quite interesting because, you're quite right. I had a business in Joburg, which I sold in the mid-90s. And I felt I was young enough to start a new career. So basically what I did was I saw a farm for sale in Franschhoek. And I went down. It was offering a decent return, and I thought, well, this is a good business to get into. Unfortunately, with respect to my idea of a farm is where you can't see your neighbours. And going down to Franschhoek, it was in fact, it was a lime farm, really hot day, 40 degrees, and I said, no, this is not for me. I didn't like the idea of living in a small town and these quite high temperatures. So the estate agent said, look, I've got a few other properties, and we eventually stumbled across this farm, which is right on the southerly boundary of the Elgin Valley. It's at 420 meters above sea level. And I thought I was going to be an apple farmer. And I very quickly realized that, the apple industry was going through a bad time at the time. South Africa deregulated its whole agricultural industry. There were control boards prior to the ANC, and all the control boards were abolished. And overnight, you've got a situation where there was, from having one exporter of fruit, there were 300. And the bottom line is the prices of fruit fell through the floorboards, and I could see I was going nowhere fast. So I did climate research. Being an engineer, I'm fairly technical and took a technical approach to things. And I did some climate research. I had my uncle who was a geomorphologist at Reading University. He helped me, and he came out and we studied the soils and compared our climate to the great wine regions of France. And I ended up finding out that, or came to the conclusion that we had a climate similar to somewhere between Sancerre and Burgundy. Anyway, I went to Professor Archer at the time, and he said, Andrew, I'm sorry to disappoint you. We live in a warm to hot wine growing region. I persuaded him, however, that I thought my rationale was correct. And we he got quite excited, and we started planting. Started with Sauvignon Blanc. That was in 98. And, it was a wonderful journey since then. In fact, our first harvest, interestingly enough, I've got a very strong connection to and respect for the Thelema guys and Giles. In fact, while I was doing my research, I went to see Ross Gower, who was the winemaker at Klein Constantia at the time. And I said to him, Ross, that was considered the cool region in South Africa at the time. And he said to me, he got excited and ended up phoning me and do you think I should buy it? And I said, absolutely. So Ross came down and I attended the auction, and Giles Webb was actually at the auction. And he bought the farm. And, sadly, Ross passed away before he was able to realize the full potential of his dream. And Giles said to me, Andrew, where are you making your wine? So I said, well, we haven't decided. I was, funny enough, talking to Mike Dobrovic at the time from Milderbosch, because he was considered Mr. Sauvignon Blanc in the early, in the late 90s. But Giles said, well, I've got spare capacity at Takara. You know, I'm happy to make the wine for you for a couple of years. And that's what we did until in 2003, we built our own cellar. And that was the story. So I've got a huge amount of respect for Thelema and the opportunity that Giles gave us. And maybe that had something to do with him buying a farm in Elgin, which he's making brilliant wines from.
And he's not the only one to have done that. There's an Elgin presence in so much of top South African wine. Go back, if you can, to your thoughts, your memories, when you decided, right, I'm going to buy this piece of land. This is me. Engineering's out the window. The apple farming, no. Winemaking is going to be the way forward. In terms of what you thought then and what you felt the challenge might be and the level of excitement, and as you look back now with over 2 decades of experience, just how much different, how much more challenging, maybe how much easier it has been to what you might have been expecting when this journey started.
No, Dan, it was much, much tougher than I ever expected. You know, I've actually been in business, in a couple of businesses, and I've had the privilege of selling a few businesses and making a few bob. And I mean, the old adage of starting with a big fortune and ending up with a small fortune certainly applies. And I ended up selling a piece of land to Takara as a result of my, I had 100 hectares up on the mountain, and we sold 30 odd hectares to Takara, which fundamentally I was running out of cash, and that gave me the cash to build a cellar and finish the business. No, it was hugely stressful. And the irony was, at the time, I was looking for partners to join me in this venture, and nobody was interested. And at one point in time, when it was still an apple farm and before the grapes had started, I was looking to sell the farm, and there was no buyers for that either. So yeah, it was almost a default situation. But I think one of the great advantages was that I had no prior knowledge of wine, no prior knowledge of wine making. I was a wine consumer. I had a fantastic mentor in Eben Archer who helped us with the planning and the planting of the vineyards. And of course, the relationship with Giles and Thelema and Takara was great. But then I appointed, of course, I put up the cellar. We didn't have much wine, and we were still operating pretty much on a shoestring. So I couldn't afford to employ a winemaker. So I was mentioning this to my friend Niels Verberg from Luddite. And Niels said to me, Andrew, that's not a problem. I'm a winemaker, and I don't have a cellar. So Niels made his Luddite wines in our cellar for the first 5 years and made Iona until we built up the business. But I think the beauty was that we grew organically. It wasn't, and I think to me, great wines are made in the vineyard. And that's what's been our great blessing and our great success, is that we've got this fantastic site. It's, I think it's been verified by Kevin Watt, who's our viticulturist, as being the coolest vineyard site in South Africa. We sit on a mountain, as I said, 420 meters above sea level. We've got no neighbors, and we're 3 kilometers from the Atlantic Ocean. So we get these cold winds coming off the sea, which cool the farm down. In any particular year, we only get maybe 10 hours above 30 degrees, which, it was tough, but it's been my sole endeavor, Dan, and it's been a great source of satisfaction and fun. And I wouldn't change it for anything. And, it's something that I think I can do well into my dotage.
Interestingly, I had Niels on the show about a month ago, and he mentioned making wine in your cellar and his relationship with Elgin, which now extends to his Cabernet Franc that he now tries to fleece to people at the GDP of Belgium a bottle. He's got a close relationship with Elgin and obviously with yourself. And I think he's very admiring, as so many of us are, of the journey that you've taken and the obstacles that you've overcome. And you've developed a lot of fans. One of them is Lisa Harlow, who says, "Good evening, Andrew. Think you know Elgin, and your wines are very special to me. That's Lisa watching on Facebook. They're very special to many people, and you have created in particular, and I mentioned this at the start of the show, Andrew, your Sauvignon Blanc. We're about to taste the Sophie to Blanche, and I'll ask you about the story and the name in a second. But your Iona Sauvignon Blanc, the standard one, I suppose. I'm not sure I know anybody who hasn't tried it. Is there for you a secret, some piece of alchemy that has turned the Iona Sauvignon Blanc into one of the must-have wines in all of South Africa?
Yeah, look, I think there has been a bit of luck. You know, when I bought the farm, and hi, Lisa, good to see you. I mean, Lisa's visited us on the farm, and she's a great fan of South African wines. So she lives in the UK. So great to see her on the show. But yeah, I think one of the things, probably, you know, I had the fortune of as I said, I read a book, and well, it was in fact an article from the Champagne House Louis Roederer, and the MD at the time said there's a couple of things that you have to do in wine. Firstly, you've got to plant the right grapes in the right climate. And secondly, you must control your own marketing and distribution and have a strong brand. Now, when I bought the farm, it was called Gielbeck's Vlei. Now, you can imagine that's not a particularly good name for a wine label. And I'm a first-generation South African. My parents are from the UK. My grandfather's from Scotland. And we trace our ancestry back to the Vikings that landed in Scotland in the 900s. And in fact, when I lived in Johannesburg, I had a house which was called Iona. And it was, that's where the Irish, you've got the Irish connection. You know, St. Columbus sailed from Ireland to the island of Iona and founded this monastery. And the Vikings were also very active there. So we decided to change the name of the farm to Iona. And so I think a combination of having a strong brand and consistently being able to make great wine due to our special climate has been the success of Iona. But I also don't use any distributors in the country. We employ all our own sales staff. My sister-in-law is my sales manager. My son sells my wine in Joburg. And so we have 4 dedicated people that only focus on Iona. And I think that's also had a lot to do with it. That is very much a family business, highly focused, and developed great relationships with retailers, restaurants. Initially, we focused on restaurants, and that gave people an opportunity to taste the wines and enjoy them, and then, of course, moved into the retail market. So yeah, no, it's been tough, but a wonderful journey, Dan.
And one spearheaded by the Sauvignon Blanc under the Iona label, and no longer celebrating the yellow-billed ducks that the farm formerly paid tribute to. We're not tasting the Iona Sauvignon Blanc this evening. It's not on the wine list here at Mala Mala, which is where I find myself. If you've just tuned in, I'm currently up at Mala Mala in the Sabi Sands Reserve. It's really tough, but these are the things I have to do sometimes, the sacrifices I have to make for this particular job. We don't have the regular, but we do have the Sophie to Blanche, which I've got here and which I've poured myself a glass of. Tell me, if you will, Mr. Gunn, who Sophie to Blanche is, how she keeps such amazing hair, and what makes this Sauvignon Blanc quite so special.
Yeah, look, it's that's also been one of, I think, you know, as I said, I think a lot of the time you have a bit of luck in business. You know, Gary Player said, the harder you practice, the luckier you get. But I certainly think that this was a lot of good fortune. In 2009, our winemaker at the time came to me. It was John Smith, ex Buchenhuis Kloof. He was with me for a year before Werner Muller, our current winemaker, joined us. I pinched him from Mark Kent, and he pinched him back again. And I must say that I did talk to Mark about employing John. But anyway, John came to me and he said, Andrew, I've got a tank of Sauvignon Blanc which I'm not entirely happy with. And so I said, well, let's taste it. And we tasted the wine, and it was good, but we felt it wasn't good enough to go into Iona. So what we did was, so I said to him, well, what are our options? So he said, well, we can sell it off as bulk. So I said, no, it's too good for that. I said, I'm going to create a second label. Because if you're making great wine, you're always going to have components that don't necessarily end up in your premium range, which we'll discuss when we come to the Mr. P. So I said to the winemaker, let's prepare it. It was 20,000 liters. And I said to a great friend of mine, Sean Harrison, who'd never designed a wine label, I said, I want to create a wine which is going to be called Sophie de Blanche. So he said, why Sophie de Blanche? I said, well, it's what I had an Afrikaans friend and who always used to come to me and said to me, Andrew, hoe gaan het met die Sophie de Blanche die jaar? So I said, what is die Sophie de Blanche? He said, well, some of us can't pronounce. In fact, our workers can't pronounce Sauvignon Blanc, but they can pronounce Sophie de Blanche. So I created this brand called Sophie de Blanche, and we call her the most famous woman to never exist. So yeah, it was a fun label, and it's created a massive following. On the back, once again, I think of quality, because I now have relationships with quite a lot of Elgin growers. They're people that planted vineyards that didn't make wine. So it's the Cape South Coast wine. In fact, we also source grapes from the Walker Bay area, but it's a wonderful wine, and it gives us an opportunity to be very selective about the components that go into our own as well.
I love that story. I was waiting for sort of Sophie de Blanche to be your maternal grandmother who'd fought in World War II, and yet that's just such a cool and quintessentially South African story, which is delightful, as is the wine. It's just a lovely, easygoing, happy to throw back Sauvignon Blanc. And for somebody who's spending his time at the moment out in the bush at Sabi Sands, I can see this featuring rather heavily in my next day or two as a very welcome indulgence. Joining us is Greg Sherwood, the Master of Wine out of London, who says, good to see you looking well, Andrew. Loving your Kloof Chardonnay at the moment. Epic wines. A thumbs up from Greg Sherwood. A thumbs up to be appreciated. He might be the worst dressed man in London, but he has one of the finest palates. And Charmaine Walters. Haha, love the name. I don't think you're the only one, Charmaine. It is a terrific wine for a really lovely wine, which now has my expectations raised, Andrew, because you've given us this wonderful example of nomenclature for your Sophie de Blanche or Sauvignon Blanc when said with a heavy accent. What of Mr. P? Now, the obvious one is, well, it's a Pinot Noir, so it's Mr. P. Is there more to it than that? And what inspires the slightly Chaplin-esque character sitting on the chair on your label?
Yeah, look, it's interesting that Greg is enjoying one of our single vineyard wines. When we created Sophie, and I decided we've got basically we've got two properties in Elgin. Well, in fact, three. Where we've got the property where we produce Solace and One Man Band, which is a red blend. But I bought a farm about 6 years ago in the northerly, the sort of, I'd say the westerly corner of the Elgin Valley. It's quite a lot warmer than Iona, which was planted to Pinot Noir and Sauvignon Blanc. So the Sauvignon Blanc goes into Sophie. And at the time, I'd also planted quite a lot of Pinot at Iona. And, if you look at the Burgundian experience, in Burgundy, they only will use grapes from 20-year-old vineyards in their Grand Crus. And the vineyard has to be at least 10 years old to use it in Premier Cru, because Pinot is a very, very difficult wine to make, mainly because it's difficult to grow. So the vines only really come into their own when they're 10 years old and really 20 years old. So Mr. P started off as a product on Iona. Once again, it was from young vines and a barrel selection. Carl was talking about his selection of Chardonnay barrels. It's much the same thing. We've got the best components going to the Iona Pinot, and anything that's left over, in other words, from barrels which we're not entirely happy with. When I say happy with, we wouldn't put a wine from a barrel that we're not happy with it in any of our wines. But from the younger vineyards, we got this Mr. P. Now, I'm interested to know what vintage you've got there, Dan.
We are drinking the 2017, Andrew.
Okay, well, it's quite interesting. I think what's happened with, if you look at the game reserves, and I noticed with the Thelema wines, they sort of, and even the Sauvignon Blanc, the Sophie, you're drinking older wines because these guys haven't had too many customers. So they're probably selling off older stock, which is a good thing and a bad thing. I mean, obviously they had to carry the inventory. But yeah, I'm going to pour myself a bit of 17. I thought it might be the 17. So Mr. P, we decided to create a Pinot Noir of a good quality that represents the style of Pinot Noir. So what does one look for in Pinot Noir? You look for freshness. If you look at the color of Pinot, firstly, it's very light. That's because the berries are very small and thin skins. And if you get too much color in Pinot, I always feel you've got to be suspicious of it because you've worked the skins too hard, you'll extract too much tannin. So what you look for is this beautiful red fruit, floral notes. And yeah, I think this Mr. P has really done well because it represents quality Pinot at an affordable price. No new wood in this wine, so it's all fermented naturally, but no new wood.
I was first introduced to this by Matthew Pearce, the rugby commentator, who phoned me up very excitedly to say, just discovered the greatest wine on earth, and had I tried it? And so I went out and found some and did thoroughly enjoy it. I asked him the question, which he couldn't answer, so I'll ask you again. Is there a Mr. P, or is it just simply a reflection of the P in Pinot Noir?
Yeah, well, that's interesting. I think you can get great wines at any price point. And I do think, it's the Elgin climate, which produces great Pinot. Some lovely Pinots coming out of Elgin. And yeah, it's I think we, in a way, like to make a contribution to, I mean, I'm not, we make quite a lot of it. So, I mean, when you make a fair amount of wines, you can't sell it at a high price. So it does represent good value. We make about 40,000 bottles, and we make a reasonable living from it. I mean, we get at a reasonable price, and we're happy with the margin. So yeah, I'm delighted that Matthew enjoyed it.
He most certainly did. I have a game drive to get to and sundowners to have, and I think I'm going to take exactly this wine with me. But before I bid you farewell, Andrew, and thank you for your time, and make a promise to come and visit you again, because it's been a few years since I've been down to Iona, and a state I didn't believe it existed because it took me so long to find you. But when I did, the reward was certainly worth it. The Sophie Blanche, Sauvignon Blanc, the Mr. P Pinot Noir. I'm out in the bush. I'm enjoying my time here at Mala Mala in the Sabi Sands. Give me something I'm pairing with each of these two wines.
Yeah, look, I think that, obviously you're going to be having some venison. Venison is wonderful with the Pinot Noir. I love, the freshness of the wine will go very well with any of the venison dishes that you have there. And the beauty of course, it's if some people, I mean, my wife, for example, very seldom drinks white wine, so she'll often have this with fish. If they've got salmon on the menu, I wouldn't imagine that, if the Mala Mala might have some nice fish. It goes very well with game fish, but definitely with any of the impalas and they won't have springbuck there. But certainly impala or some of the game that you probably get. And Sophie, of course, is very versatile. It's a light, easy drinking wine. Great with chicken, great with salads. Of course, with fish, prawns. I don't know whether they have any up there. You're quite close to Mozambique, so you might get the odd prawn on the menu. But yeah, I think you're going to enjoy it out there. I was up at Ngala not too long ago, and it was absolutely fantastic to sit on a vehicle, have a cold glass of Sauvignon Blanc, and you're very privileged, Dan, and I envy you being up there. So enjoy it.
I certainly will. And I think two things just remind me on an evening like this of how fortunate I am to call South Africa home. One is these surrounds, and I'm looking out the window here at Mala Mala. The elephants have moved on, but I can see some impala, a few water buckets, just so natural and beautiful and relaxing. But it is being paired with some fantastic South African wine, and the combination is terrific. A word from Reginald Peckler, who's up at Cheetah Plains, not too far from where I am now. Also, the Sabi Sands one-man band, Sophie de Blanche, are my lifetime favorite juicers. Nice to see King in the making. And Josephine Prieur, who joins us quite regularly from France. Bonjour, Andrew. Always a big pleasure to come and taste your wines at Iona. Oh, I love the Pinot and Chardonnay, and also the Syrah. Beautiful and fresh, elegant wines. Andrew, you've given us not just some great wines, but some terrific stories. The Sophie de Blanche name in particular is fantastic. Thank you for them. I'm going to take them off now and enjoy the sunset and the tail end of a game drive, and really appreciate both your time and two fantastic wines. So thank you.
Thanks, Dan. Look forward to seeing you in Elgin, and all the best. Are the rat race still running Mala Mala?
They, to the best of my knowledge, indeed they are, and clearly selecting good wines in the process.
Thanks, Dan. Take care. Okay.
I'm Andrew Gunn from Iona down in Elgin, wrapping up a very special edition of Dan Really Likes Wine from Mala Mala in the Sabi Sands, preceded by Rudy joining us from Thelema. 4 terrific wines in a beautiful stretch of the world. Remember, Black Friday still extends through Pick and Pay, particularly if you're a member of the Pick and Pay Wine Club, where you get all sorts of bonuses, discounts on wine, free delivery online with 6 bottles or more, and extra Smart Shopper points. If you're not a member, very easy to do so. Just send your Smart Shopper number through to 36775 to join, and keep drinking and supporting South African wine. Remember that on Sunday I will be at the Maslow with that very special wine picnic with some great wines from across South Africa, and that includes wines from Anthony Rupert, Lomoran, Tierra del Capo, Protea, Cape Point Vineyards, Haute Cabrera, and Takara. A full picnic, great music and wine. I'm going to go and join the rest of my game drive. Thank you so much for joining us. Big thank you to Mala Mala and to Ranger Buck Safaris, and I'll see you on Monday night for Thursday evening for some great wine from the Maslow. Thanks for joining us. Take care. Cheers and good night.